Well, good morning to everyone that has just joined us, and hello to everyone watching the replay. Welcome to another one of our online learning webinars. This time it's all about mould and damp, the basics. I'm your host, Andy Ferguson, and today joining me and welcoming back Steve Hodgson, CEO of the PCA. We are about to start the main presentation. Now, I can say there has been a stack load of folk that have just joined us, so I'm just going to repeat here that if you do have a question over the course of the webinar, feel free just to post that into the comments box, either run down your right or left-hand side of your screen, or if you're on mobile, just pull up and you'll see it there. Again, if you want to email me your question, all you need to do is just send it to andy@property-care.org. That's andy@property-care.org. Or again, if you are socially savvy, you can just simply send it via Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook. Steve, I can see we've probably got about a minute or so just before we start. I know you have a busy day ahead of you today, but I know as well that you are being pulled from pillar to post by all sorts of people and organisations eager to learn more about condensation, mould and damp. I mean, are you still finding that off the back of the what happened back in November and what is continuously happening up to now?
I think I'll kind of have a sort of a different way around of answering your question. I think that this year, I think, was always going to be a year where mold and condensation, atmospheric moisture issues were going to be at the front of a lot of people's minds. That came from, you know, looking forward even from this time last year when we could see that fuel prices were going up, cost of living was hitting people. It was very likely that there were going to be an increased frequency of problems and therefore increased demand. I think that the terrible events of a couple of years ago that led to the inquest that found and reported in the latter part of 2022 was really a focus for everybody. It was, you know, it was described as a wake-up call and a moment in time that changed everything, and I kind of believe it probably was and should have been, and in many respects. It's shame on us all that it took something like that to kind of kickstart what we're seeing at the moment, which is an enormous uplift in inquiries, not just to the association, but to the association members for good diagnostics on damp and mould.
Well, here, folks, I can see that is bang on 9 o'clock. So I suppose kind of getting into the main presentation itself. Well, Steve, we've been saying it for a while and we've just been saying it just right there, but condensation, mould and dampness in buildings in general, it has had some amount of prolonged scrutiny, both from government and media, and for good reason, as folks have just heard. But for those that are not necessarily damp and mould specialists, how do we better understand this problem? What are the basics that we need to know, and what can we do?
Okay, don't overegg it, Andy. This morning, I am going to pick this up and take over now and sort of start. But you know, when I was doing this, we thought about how we could sort of bring this whole conversation about dampness in buildings back to basics. So if you're a specialist or a chartered building surveyor or one of the PCA members that are tuning into this, you're probably in the wrong place for the next hour. The presentation is really the basic principles of having some orientation around dampness in buildings. The first part of the presentation looks at sort of water penetration and groundwater, but then the majority of the presentation towards the end is much more focused on understanding a little bit about the processes that are involved with mold growth and condensation and atmospheric moisture imbalance. So I'm gonna kind of roll into it very slowly. What you also got to imagine is that this is what I've done since I was 19 years old. So trying to explain some of these principles and processes in the space of 40 minutes is something of a challenge, and it's incredibly difficult to know what to pull in and what to pull out. So, you know, you really will have to excuse the fact that it is pretty basic, pretty straightforward, and that this can never be, if you're interested in the subject, the end of a process. This has to be really the very, very beginning of kind of understanding that there's more to it than perhaps meets the eye. So the things that we want to look at today are kind of considering dampness in the round. And, you know, the words moisture, dampness, wet, water, all of those kind of seem interchangeable. But basically, when we're talking about moisture, we're talking about water. Dampness is water. It is just free water. It's water in the wrong place that's doing damage. And we have to think about water in buildings as the primary vector for building failure. Well, we'll look at that in a second. But we also have to think, when we're engaging with buildings and engaging with people that live in those buildings, about the effects not just on the bricks and mortar, but on the people in the houses as well. We'll think about sources of moisture, preventing problems, and we'll look incredibly quickly at repair, remediation, and recovery. But we're not going to tell you how to do it, but we're going to sort of cover some of the very basic principles. So for those people who know something about dampness, the only thing that's in this presentation for you is a big lump of my photo library. So I think there's some quite interesting pictures that keep you engaged, even if the content is quite simple. So, you know, how do buildings fail? They fall down because the foundations aren't good enough. And that's something that has afflicted buildings since the day we started putting one brick or one piece of wood on top of another. We're not looking at that today. Buildings get hit by things, whether that's the wind, the rain, impacts. We bash them, knock them, bump holes in them, and they fall down. But actually, the common thread with an awful lot of building failures, and the vast majority of building failures, is the effects of water and the effects of free water, liquid water moving around. So that's what we're going to focus on, of course. So before we kind of get into things, it's worthwhile thinking about what water facilitates, what water can lead to. So it provides a mechanism where plants and animals can use building materials for food. So let's take wood for example. It's a great example. In its dry state, a piece of wood can last for an indefinite amount of time. There's pieces of wood in service or kicking about right now that are many hundreds of years old, if not, you know, over 1,000 years old, that still works. It hasn't been eaten by anything, and it still has its structural integrity. Now that's you know, could be lost in a moment if that timber starts to get wet. And as it gets wet, the animals and plants that can use the materials in that starchy material, in that starchy piece of timber, can start to move in and degrade it, biodegrade it, eat it. So so that whole process of plants and animals living on building materials is quite important. But water also acts as a transport mechanism, and it also, unfortunately, has this horrible habit with water of when it freezes, it expands, and that breaks things down. So the bugs and fungus that kind of find a way in and are early colonizers for damp construction materials are things like mites and molds and insects, beetles and fungi. We see those commonly all over the place. Some of them are inconsequential, but actually quite a lot of them, particularly when they're in our homes, do have consequences. So the other thing that we talked about, water being a mechanism for transportation. So one of the things that water doesn't do when it's at any volume in construction materials or anything for that matter is it moves about. It wants to go from its source and diffuse through the construction materials. Anything that's porous, anything that has the ability for that to happen, it will move. And the salts that move around around from the ground, or from contamination, or from what all various number of things, can move through the building. As they crystallise, they cause problems. Now, I have to say that the photograph there next to the pillar, that is taken from a church last year, is something that my kids got for Christmas. I was absolutely amazed that within 12 hours of putting a salty solution on a piece of cardboard with some felt tip pens, that actually all that salt deposition happened. So it really shows how quickly, in the right circumstances, water can act as a transport mechanism for salts. Salts can be very, very, very damaging. What else does water facilitate? It corrodes stuff. It causes unprotected steel, metal, iron to corrode, and as it corrodes, it expands. So you can see there on those slides, there's a cavity wall tie that is corroded, and that leads to structural failures. There's also on the right hand side, that is also evidence of cavity wall tie failure, but that's on the inside of the building where we've got an advanced problem. The photograph in the middle is one of my favourite photographs. It's a building in Glasgow that I didn't have anything to do with, but passed in the street, and you can see that it's a metal sheet building riveted together, and it's rusty. Yeah, it's my only picture of a rusty house. We also mentioned very quickly that water freezes. And water is one of the only materials, I think, maybe even, I'm not a chemist, I'm not a scientist, but as far as I'm aware, it's probably one of the only materials that, as it turns from a liquid to a solid, it expands rather than contracts. And that process can be incredibly damaging, both on a micro and a macro scale. So even smaller ice crystals that form in porous materials can blow the face off bricks. It can slowly start to erode or accelerate erosion. But it also does things like, pull bridges apart and causes pipes to burst and all that kind of stuff. So what does water damage look like? Well, we're probably all familiar with the effects of water in construction materials. We have collapses, we have denaturing and swelling and warping and delamination of materials. And that's often caused where you have things like timber particle fibre boards that are in their dry state nice and solid, but if they get wet, they swell. And once they've swollen, the materials that make it up have absorbed some water. It breaks the bonds between the elements that are glued together or held together. And when it dries, it doesn't go back. So those glue bonds, those bonds that are created in the manufacture are broken. That's the same with things like plasterboards that just get wet and dry out. They generally don't go back to their original state. Laminates, chipboards, those sorts of things. There isn't necessarily any fungal action there. It is just the fact that the cells have absorbed water, swollen, broken the bonds, and it doesn't go back. You also get staining and spoiling, and that's part of the staining. Certainly is part of that water movement, where it's dragging contamination and muck from wherever the source is through the materials and then depositing on the surface. Can be quite difficult and tricky to deal with. You need to know what you're doing. And again, we have wood and other materials that become food for other organisms. So where does the water come from? We're not going to look too hard at the range of things. We're going to stick with the kind of the three main threads, if you like. We're going to look at groundwater, we're going to look at water penetration, and we're going to look at atmospheric moisture that leads to mould and condensation. So let's look at groundwater first. Rising damp, penetrating damp below ground. It's why the water rising through capillary reaction or moving horizontally and vertical as a result of hydrostatic pressure. It's very, very common. It's also sometimes overstated. It's scarcity. It is very common, but it's not always a problem. And there's some photographs there showing that these are photographs where the only source of possible moisture can be from the ground, and you can see the results. You generally have tide marks and that sort of stuff. that give it away, above ground, and it's very obvious below ground. So where does the water come from? When we're talking about rainwater, well, it comes from rain, and that's why I like to call it rainwater penetration and not penetrating damp or anything else when it's above ground, because it signals that it's come from the sky. The thing with rainwater penetration is it generally starts at the top of a structure where it gets in, and it works its way down. And if you think about how you might drop water into the centre of a sponge, you may well have a small point at the top where the water's being applied to that sponge, but by the time you get to the bottom of it, it goes down through the material like a cone. So often you'll find that that relatively minor defects at high level will naturally lead to quite sizable amounts of moisture at lower down. Occupation. So condensation, moisture, if you like, moisture that leads to mould, and internal moisture imbalances, it is generally water generated by the activities of habitation. So it's the stuff that we do, and again we'll look at these things in slightly more detail in a minute. I've also put in a slide about flooding. Flooding is kind of sits aside from all of this, but you can think about flooding not just as fluvial river flooding or groundwater flooding, but actually you can think about it in respect of releases of water from burst pipes and all that sort of stuff. But these are usually events that are outside the design expectations of a building. They're calamitous things, and they're dealt with probably slightly differently. However, the basic principles of recovery, I have to say, about drying out, understanding causes, redesign, etc., stand scrutiny. So let's think about groundwater and how and why that happens. So to get groundwater to come up or through a wall, the soil conditions have to be such that water can be held there. You have to have precipitation, so you have to have water coming into the ground from somewhere, or you have to have water from drainage or something else that's failing. But you have to have a loading of water in the ground. You also need a substrate, so a wall or a floor or whatever it might be, that is susceptible to that. And let's be honest, most masonry structures are. One of the ways that we can design against that is to build materials that don't have the ability to transfer water through them or up them. But actually, let's be honest, most construction materials that we've been using for the last few hundred years have a degree of porosity, and will allow water either to rise through them or be transported through them. The other thing that we can say that both the height, when you're looking at rising damp, and the rate of movement into occupied spaces is dependent on the rate of evaporation. So if you have water evaporating at the base of a wall faster than it can rise, or you have sufficient height in the wall to prevent it just continuing up, and your evaporation characteristics are correct, then actually that can have a significant effect on the height of rise or the rate of movement. The point being, though, that this is seasonal too, so it changes winter and summer. So how do we control groundwater? And this is really in the simplest of terms. We either do nothing, because actually sometimes you don't need to. If you've got a situation where building materials are not susceptible to that groundwater rise, or you have no need to use the space or protect that space from the effects of water, there's nothing vulnerable, you can leave it alone. Another way, and it's a perfectly legitimate way of managing it, is to reduce the water in the soil, and you do that through drainage, or you do that by moving the water away for some reason, or covering the ground. There are a number of ways to do it. Can be incredibly expensive to try and do that in a retrospective way, and it also needs a lot of maintenance. The other way to control groundwater is to block it. And there are, a whole world of ways in which we control water, either penetration or rise through blocking it. And the third is, and I put this in, so the top photograph is a basement, and that shows a bituminous material stuck on a wall. on the outside of a box. That is absolutely, the epitome of putting a material that blocks the passage of water. You see the one that's sort of partly obscured by my head is a bituminous damp proof course, and I took that photograph because it's oozing out of the wall and it's a great picture. But the other photographs are probably another way that is used to try and control water. I don't have very much truck with it, but that's a form of siphon system. That photograph was taken in France. They are brass fittings stuck in triangular holes in an attempt to try and increase the rate of evaporation and keep the building dry. I don't have very much truck with those sorts of systems. They don't kind of work for very long. However, they have been very popular in Europe, and there are outlets in the UK, of course. But yeah, not one for me, I'm afraid. So we'll talk about rainwater penetration. Rainwater penetration usually caused by defective rainwater management systems, so gutters, fall pipes, drains, that sort of stuff. But also, very commonly it's caused by holes in the fabric. So whether that's missing slate, damaged roof, bad flashings, or something like the top photograph top right, which is a photograph I took very recently of a property in London, where you've got a cracked sill and a split below, and that's a perfect mechanism for water hitting the facade to run into the structure. We've also got issues with porosity. So building materials that have high rates of porosity, so they can take on water very readily, usually rely on high rates of evaporation to be able to work in balance, so they don't wet down. However, in some circumstances, materials are too porous and their moisture exposure is too great, and you get an imbalance and water gets into the structure in greater volumes than can evaporate out during periods of drying. This can be affected by coatings and changes of exposure and cavity wall insulation. All sorts of interventions can tip a balance. So porosity is something that's really important to think about if you've got water penetration problems. Things like through stones and solid walls, and that sort of thing can encourage it. And poor design. The photographs on the right-hand side, yes, they are holes in the building or they are rainwater issues, but they are inherently bad design and prone to failure. The one thing about water penetration and groundwater is that lots of things can be happening at the same time. So, the photograph there, the long photograph, shows a gutter that's a downpipe that's broken, but we've also got a crack in the external coatings. And so which is the major problem? Well, they both work together, and as the water goes into that crack and the plants grow inside the crack opens, the rate of water ingress increases, and so the problems go through like that. You then add to the complication of that particular issue that external coatings are reducing evaporation enormously, and actually the water's got nowhere to go but in. So this is where the subject, and this is where your diagnostic process gets a little bit more complicated. The job on the right hand side looks like a cavity wall tie job. It's not. It's the removal of cavity wall insulation, and that again is an issue of both poor design, porosity, bad product selection, etc. Where you've got water penetration that probably would not have been a problem when the cavities were clear, but the cavities get blocked and you've got a vector for transfer, etc., and the kind of the balance breaks down. So you've got to think logically about these things. So preventing rainwater penetration, these again are very, very simple things in many regards. So we have to think about planned maintenance. Planned maintenance is absolutely something, as far as I'm concerned, is a must for every householder, every organisation, every property management company. And if something I learned at building college when I was 17 years old is planning and undertaking maintenance regimes is a massive kind of way of avoiding problems. But unfortunately, we're not wired that way, and we wouldn't have the industry around preservation that we had if everybody looked after their buildings perfectly. Improving design, absolutely. Making sure we have compatible materials that can manage their exposure characteristics. And I think personally as well, we also have to understand human nature. and how things are, because people don't maintain their buildings well, people don't understand the issues of compatibility, people don't always report damage when it's or deal with damage when it first occurs. So actually, using very friable materials where we know people are going to have high impact damage, for example, or high traffic is an area where failure can occur. So how do we recover from issues of rainwater penetration? I think that when surveyors are involved with this, I think one of the important things is to really understand the mode of failure. So you don't just deal with the damp problem, understand where the water's come from, fix that, make sure that is rectified in a way that you can reduce future points of ingress or future failure, and then you dry the building, then you repair the building, and you improve the design if you possibly can as you move forward. So let's talk about atmospheric moisture, occupation water, whatever you want to call it, that leads to condensation, high humidity, and therefore mould. It is almost without doubt the most common form of problematic water in buildings. For every real problem building where somebody's got mold growth that is affecting them either physically, mentally, or damaging construction materials, there's probably another 4 or 5 out there where we've got small levels of underlying mold growth that actually probably don't cause us any problems, can be wiped away or managed in a very relaxed sort of way, comes and goes simply because it gets cold outside, and we've got a shower that kind of works over time without the fans to suck all the water out. A bit like my house, really. We've got a little bit of damp this year, a bit of condensation from mould this year. It doesn't really bother me, and I keep wiping it away. It's not going to cause anybody, apart from my partners, any grief at all. So where does this occupation water come from? I think probably most of us understand this. It's mostly from us. Well, it's nearly all exclusively from us, or the imbalanced water is. It comes from breathing and respiration. It comes from drying and evaporation. So not just clothes, but we're talking about taking a coat off when it's been wet outside and hanging on a hook. It comes from cooking. It comes from fish tanks. It comes from our pets. It may come from leaks and that sort of stuff if it's being released into the air. Not very much though. I've also put down it comes from burning fossil fuels. So burning gas, burning wood also liberates water, but most of the time, if that's done in a reasonably responsible way, it's flued out. And actually, when you're burning timber or coal in a log burner, the fact is that it needs oxygen for that combustion process to take place. So it drags moisture out of the air with the air and gets rid of it. So a lot of the times these things don't add to the loading, but reduce it. The exception there, of course, is bottle gas heaters and those sorts of things that aren't externally fluid, but they're very uncommon these days. I don't think that that's something that we see very often in 2023. Something that we used to see quite a lot in the 80s and 90s, but not so much now. But we've also got to remember that the external atmosphere is a contributor to the moisture load. There is water outside. Water in the air. So it's worth mentioning that there's often 2 types of condensation described. It's the same process, it's the same water, but we have surface condensation. This is water that occurs on the surface of a material, and then interstitial condensation, which describes water that is deposited inside either the body of a piece of material, or sometimes it relates to condensation that occurs within the layers of a piece of construction. So within a roof, for example, or within a wall, but not necessarily inside the block, but again something in a void inside that element of construction. So condensation simply describes the change of state of water from a gas to a liquid. Condensation is that moment when the water changes from a gas to a liquid because the air can't hold it any longer. And really, to understand humidity and how much, you know, the RH thing that I'm sure everybody's kind of heard for air to hold water is probably the key to understanding humidity. We'll kind of go on to that now, but we'll think about mold for a moment. What is mold? And mold is this consequence of high humidity and high water contents. So most molds in homes, and I know there's a slight error in the explainer here, but most molds like to be neither too hot nor too cold, nor too wet nor too dry. So kind of a bit like the conditions that we prefer. They like that balance. Mold will grow in relatively cold conditions where it's nice and moist, but slower. And it will grow in relatively drier conditions, but it has to be nice and warm. The fact is that there is a balance. Like most things, it has a preferred range of growth. In the right conditions, mold will grow relatively quickly. In suboptimal conditions, it can still grow, but it will grow much more slowly. One of the things that I haven't got a slide on, and I'm not going to go over too heavily, is the fact that nobody that I know can tell what mold is what by looking. Black mold is black mold. You know, yellow mold and blue mold are just describers of what you see on the day. That does not necessarily describe the genus or the species or the type of mold that you have. And I kind of sort of say that anybody that says this is aspergillus or this is penicillium or this is whatever it is, unless they have taken samples, taken them to a lab, they are guessing, absolutely guessing. But for me, it really doesn't matter. The fact that you have mold growth present is an indication of imbalance. It shows that you have the conditions that are correct for mold growth, and therefore there is an issue that needs to be investigated. The type of mold is far less important than its presence. It's an indicator of an issue. It's not the issue itself, in my view. So molds need to eat. Molds can survive on almost anything and almost nothing. So you can see mold growing in the bottom picture quite clearly on the outside of a plastic soffit. I'm not quite sure why it did it, but it was very interesting to me to take it. And I can't quite understand the conditions that were required for that to happen, but there you go. But we see mold often growing on glass and plastics and all sorts of stuff. Now, it's clearly not feeding off the glass or the plastic, but it can survive on very, very small particles of detritus, human skin, you know, residue, dust, whatever. It doesn't need much. But what it does need is some water and some food, and you know, depriving it of either is the way to go. So, in theory, killing mold where it's growing is very easy. You either dry it out and desiccate it, and that stops it from growing, and you achieve that by ventilation, reducing moisture production in the building, so trying to control how much moisture goes into the air. You insulate structure and heat, and actually that process of drying out and changing the conditions to reduce the opportunity for mold to growth is in many respects the best long-term solution, or it's really the only long-term solution. And I've kind of flippantly put starve it to death or poison it. Now, starving it to death and poisoning it really kind of describes cleaning. So if you can wash it off. You can clean surfaces so they're spotlessly clean. If you can deprive the mold of what it needs to survive by way of food, then you can also kill it that way. Much more difficult because it don't need much. But the use of anti-fungicidal paints and washes and wipes and all of that sort of stuff is highly effective in the short term. Can provide solutions that can get you out of trouble, if you like. But the fact of the matter is, for the long term, that changing the conditions to prevent growth is much better than continuous cleaning or cycles of trying to either poison it or wipe it away. So I'm going to try something new. I don't know whether this will work, but I'm going to try. You may have seen on other presentations the use of buckets and balloons and all sorts of other things to describe relative humidity and moisture loadings. Well, that's probably something that will take a little bit more description, and I'm not going to do that today. But what I thought I'd do is just kind of look at what moisture meters tell us and what they actually mean. So, indulge me and, criticize me if I get this wrong. It may go terribly topsy-turvy, but let's see if we can kind of actually understand what our moisture meters and what these pieces of equipment that many of us carry are actually telling us. So these were taken, I did these last week, last Friday, in fact, and I hope that they kind of, working through what this lot of stuff means might be valuable. So this is outside last Friday, mid-morning. It was 7 degrees outside. And you can see there's a bit of fluctuation on the temperature. That's the figure in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen on here. And it shows that we've got about 7 degrees centigrade outside. And that is giving us a relative humidity at 64.6% RH. So that means that the air is holding 64.6% of its capacity of water at that temperature. And so what's left is that about 35% of space left for water to go into the air. Now, what that is also showing us is that we've got 4 grams per kilogram of water inside the air. So that's 4 grams of water in a kilogram of air. So that's a relatively small amount of water. That's perfectly normal for a winter's day in January. A little bit of water, but it's exerting a pressure on the air because the water vapor exerts a pressure of 0.7 kilopascals. Now, 0.7 kilopascals, when you consider that 1 kilopascal is kind of the normal range for outside, is 0.7. So we've got a day where we've got low pressure. And the dew point that comes from the calculation that the machine does on all of that is 1 degree. So that means if the temperature drops from 7.4 degrees to 1 degree C, then you will have 100% relative humidity and water will be liberated from the air. So let's just kind of move on and see what it's like inside. Same day, same meter, just moved from outside onto the table of my office. So at that point, what does that tell us? And I hope people will look at those readings and say, that looks like a healthy space to be. Well, it is. 48 degrees, 19 degrees centigrade. So it's not particularly warm, but it's certainly not cold. We've got a relative humidity of 48%. So that is basically only 50% of the air's capacity to carry water. We've got 6.7 grams of water in the air per kilogram of 7.6 grams of water in a kilogram of air. Again, not too bad, absolutely fine. And we've got 1.1. The vapor pressure is 1.1 kilopascals. So we've now got to a point where that water is exerting some pressure in the air. And so, we've seen that go up by 0.4 of a kilopascal. So that's quite significant, but that's absolutely fine for an occupied space. That's considered to be a dry and very healthy environment. And the dew point is 7.9%. So if we've got an air temperature of 19 and a dew point of 7.9, that's the point at which the relative humidity would hit 100%. We'd get water being delivered. That's really pretty healthy. That's really pretty healthy place to be, and it's very unlikely that you get condensation. So let's look at the final one, which took some preparation. I had to boil a kettle in a very small room, but now we've got an incredibly wet environment. Now we've got 14 grams of water in the air and at 94% relative humidity with 2.3 kilopascals of pressure. That's a really unhealthy room. But what we can derive from that is that we've got a room where we've got lots of water, we've got a lot of water that wants to get out, because where you've got pressure, and that's the kilopascal reading, we've got 0.7 outside and 2.3 in that room. So that water wants to get out. It wants to leave that building. It wants to equalize. If the pressures want to equalize. So you've got a mechanism there for transport. And you've also got, when you look at the dew point characteristics, you've got a temperature of 20.5, but a dew point of 19.6. It is very, very, very likely, in fact, almost certain, that the envelope of the building that is containing that air is going to be at or below that dew point, because that's the nature of boxes. If you've got a colder environment outside, a warmer environment inside, the box that separates the two is bound to be colder. So I don't know whether that's worked, but really what I wanted to try and explain is that actually the instruments that many of us have are very, very good. They help us enormously, and actually getting to understand what they mean and the context and how to use them is incredibly important. And that's one of the things that we major on in the PCA. They're very, very poor tools in the wrong hands, but if you understand them, they can be incredibly powerful. So the consequences of high relative humidity. High RH indicates that there's free water will be liberated if the fabric of the box is not working well. So if you get cold walls, cold floors, high relative humidity, it's very likely that you'll get condensate. When you've got very high humidity and high temperatures, then you've got perfect conditions for mold growth, even if you don't reach the RH, even if you don't have free water liberated by way of drops of water on the wall. If you get to 60, 70, 80% RH and you have static state conditions for any period of time, you are highly likely to get mold growth. What's the consequences of having a lot of water? And we're talking about the total moisture content of the air. Well, this indicates that you've got high production. You've got water getting into the air and staying in the air. It will have a direct relation to vapor pressure. And it shows in many respects that you've got high production and you've probably got poor ventilation. What I would say is that you have to separate to some degree the issue of relative humidity and grams per kilogram, because grams per kilogram does not consider temperature, where RH absolutely is temperature dependent. So the consequences of high vapor pressure is that is the transport mechanism to move water in the air around a building, and it also can be used to get rid of it too. That's what trickle vents do. Trickle vents give an opportunity for a building to actually expel water in a relatively controlled way. Most buildings leak. Lots of buildings leak very badly. And what happens if you have a buildup of vapor pressure? That vapor pressure will leak out of those cracks and crevices. In a building that's been retrofitted or works with a high performance building, high vapor pressures can be really problematic if you don't have continuity of vapor checks and all that kind of stuff. I find myself disappearing off down a blind alley when I start talking about this if I'm not careful. But yes, vapor pressure is important as a mechanism for transport. And the consequences of a high dew point. If you have a high dew point, it means you're very, very, very much more likely that the box will not be able to support its temperature. You're very likely to find places inside the structure where you've got cold areas. You're very much more likely to get condensation and again mold growth when you discover on your meter that you have a high dew point. So how do you tackle moisture and atmospheric imbalance? Moisture production, if you can reduce it at all. Ventilation, of course, but you need to balance ventilation. Ventilation should be adequate. We shouldn't over ventilate because that strips heat out of the building, and that brings us on to energy inputs. Buildings have to be kept warm, unfortunately. We have to do as much as we can to keep them in balance, and that includes burning energy, inducting energy to keep the place warm, and absolutely fundamental to that. And so we don't contradict everything that we're trying to do with ventilation and energy inputs, is the building should be thermally efficient, or as thermally efficient as we can make it. So we don't want cold spots, we don't want thermal bypasses, and we don't want elements of the building envelope that can't manage and can't retain the heat. Now, I would like to say that the kind of, as far as tackling atmospheric moisture is concerned and imbalance, some problems that we see are structural. So, for example, the fan unit that you can see in those photographs there was taken this summer. That fan in that bathroom cannot possibly be doing anything with a piece of flexi duct that long with as many kinks and twists in it. So some issues are structural. It might relate to thermal performance, the type of heating, the type of ventilation, and all of those things. Some are cultural and relate to the way people occupy building and use their buildings, and some, of course, are economic. If people just don't have the money to heat a building, you're on a total whooping, and you can't. There's nothing that you can do to overcome that. So apart from either make the energy cheaper or give them money to heat their building, and that was one of my frustrations going back many years. Was actually, I considered that a lot of the problems that I was seeing, particularly in private domestic rented properties and also in social housing, was actually the result of poverty rather than anything wrong with the building or anything of that nature. So imbalance. I'm kind of winding things up, and I've got to be careful not to be too much on a hobby horse. But that statement I think holds true. I don't think I've ever met anybody who wanted to grow moles on their walls, and I don't believe actually that blaming occupants out of hand for the problems that they're living with and the problems that they're facing is naturally a healthy or a reasonable thing to do. There are situations where, of course, property owners, tenants, occupants don't make their lives any easier, and there are tenants that are scurrilous and are trying to sort of get a new house or something. But I find those people are very, very few and far between, and most problems they are living with are very, very, very difficult and troublesome for them and difficult to sort out, particularly as there's all sorts of other issues going on. But despite the fact that disputes are common, I absolutely believe that the technology, the knowledge and the experts exist. If the will is there and the cash to actually make a change and change some of the elements of the construction, I believe that most issues can be resolved. It's been an incredibly quick rattle through stuff. I hope there's been something in there that has either entertained or caught your imagination. I really don't mind either if people want to grumble and give me a hard time about what's up there. I think the debate is always very welcome and always very, very worthwhile. We have, as Andy said, loads of stuff on the website. We do lots of training. We're doing tons of stuff at the moment with housing associations, trying to sort of reduce issues and educate wherever possible those who have to deal face to face with very tricky situations, how to manage those and how to understand certainly the technical elements that sit behind some of the problems that you're facing on a daily basis. So please engage with us. We're pretty approachable. We are very interested in both directing people to our members who can help, but also very interested in ensuring that people that want knowledge can get knowledge. So Andy, I'm sure that I've seen lots and lots of comments. You know that I do have to go at 10 o'clock very promptly, so happy to pick up any questions for the next few minutes. Again, we will stop this at 10 o'clock.
Yes, we will be stopping this sharp at 10 o'clock. But here, firstly, just on behalf of just everyone tuning in today, just many thanks, Steve, for sharing all that info. Hopefully everyone agrees it was very insightful. If I move straight on to questions, just to let you know, we don't have a lot of questions in at the moment, so if you do want to pose a question, do feel free just to go to the chat facility and we can pick it up. But I'm going to start off with some of the email questions that came across, Steve. First one came from Joseph Green. Now, he's posing this from an energy point of view. So thinking about the cost of heating from an energy point of view, is using one or more modern dehumidifiers a reasonable solution to a mouldy house scenario relative to, say, PIV, positive pressure units, or other forms of ventilation? What do you think?
Okay, it's kind of a bit like comparing apples and pears at that point. If you have there are situations where dehumidifiers can be useful. Personally, I think that mostly dehumidifiers are useful when you're recovering a building from flooding or water ingress, and you've got the ability to add heat and also get rid of the water. Dehumidifiers in most domestic situations, they can tip the balance, they can reduce a problem a bit, but they require maintenance. The tanks have to be emptied every day. They require to work well. Most refrigerant dehumidifiers need a band of both humidity and of temperature that allows them to work most efficiently. That's often not done. I kind of think of dehumidifiers almost as the products of last resort, because I don't see them regularly used well. I don't often see them used well. If you're talking about ventilation strategies, positive input ventilations are one strategy that can be used. And I'm a very strong exponent of PIV in the right places, in the right situations. But I would also consider that constant duty fans and other mechanisms for ventilation are also a winner. Now, the problem was that you started the question with a note about energy. And the fact is, all the ventilation and all the dehumidification in the world is not necessarily going to create healthy and good levels of comfort if the place is freezing cold. And so that, it really is a balance. So just trying to dehumidify or ventilate a house where the occupants are trying to live at 14 degrees is never going to be a successful outcome. It's really going to be difficult. And actually, they should be, the real trick is to direct them to warm it up a little bit, get the ventilation right, and actually bring the building into a state of balance. So yeah, that you cannot work with a even when you're talking about retrofit and insulation. What that does is reduce your heating requirement. It doesn't eliminate it unless you've got processes where you've got lots of solar gain or you've got solar PV that are your primary heating mechanisms. But you've got to put some heat in for that building to retain.
There we go, folks. Yeah, folks, and see there's a lot of comments here with regards to asking about the slides and if this will be recorded. Just to let you know, there is a recording of this presentation. It will get sent out in the next day or two. Slides aren't available, but as I said, anyone that's on the registration list will automatically get this recording that you can share out to whoever you want to share out. Cracking on here, Steve, because all of a sudden questions are coming in thick and fast. So we're trying to get through as many as I can before 10 o'clock. Next one comes from Nadeem Shahid. He is asking, how much of an impact has increasing insulation within properties impacted in damp and mould issues, in your opinion?
Oh, good grief! Either you know me or you've read some of the stuff I've been throwing out. That's a whole nother presentation. That's a whole nother day. That's 8 hours in the pub. The fact is that in the right situations, in the right conditions, and when it's done thoughtfully and carefully, retrofit and the increasing amount of insulation inside a building will be a very positive thing, because what it does is it warms the inside surfaces up. It means that you get better bang for your buck for your energy spend, so the building is warmer, and all of that stuff. And so let's start with the positive. Well insulated, well designed, either from new or retrofitted buildings, should, in most circumstances, return a building that is more moisture safe. However, even in those sorts of buildings, the ventilation characteristics and the ventilation is absolutely fundamental to both moisture risk and thermal comfort. One of the things that I'm really interested in, we've done lots of stuff around, and those of you who've maybe seen some of the stuff that we've been doing around PIV and EWI and cavity wall insulation and all of that kind of stuff, is it's not to knock this stuff, because it's absolutely fundamental that as a country we get on with improving the thermal performance of our buildings. What's really important too is that we do it well, because there's an awful lot of things that we can do in the retrofitting process that provides pathways and moisture risk that actually good design and good installation can eliminate, but poor installation and poor design can really cause a problem with. And so we've seen lots of issues around water penetration when cavity walls are essentially turned into solid walls by insulation fill, particularly where you've got levels of very high wind-driven rain, where that hasn't been thought through. And we're now seeing an increased number of problems with external wall insulation that was done a few years ago, where in one of those slides you may have seen there was a gutter that was sort of stuck. The stop end finished against the wall, and they'd worked the insulation around it. The stop end leaked, and the water got down behind the insulation. So there's lots and lots and lots of potential for defects with retrofit, but that should not put us off the retrofit path, because it's really important that we improve the thermal capacity of the thermal performance of our existing buildings.
Well, here are, but again, questions coming in quick and fast. Please feel free just to send them over. We might not be able to ask the question today, but if Steve has time, I will pass the questions over to him. But I'm going to try and combine the question here with the purposes of trying to get through as many. This is a similar question, comes from Mark O'Halloran and Michael Kelly. Mark's asking that he's seeing a lot of modern breathable felts that are prone to surface condensation, usually where there is thick insulation at the ceiling level, making the roof space very cold. Yeah. Is there a solution for this? And should we be considering proper vapor control layers under the insulation here?
Okay, so that's really interesting. I guess you're a chartered surveyor and you've seen lots of these sorts of situations this winter. Let's think about, again, I'm going to draw on a little bit on the presentation. Condensation will occur when you have 100% RH. And if you've got a medium that is a breather membrane and is, it's highly vapor permeable, if that medium is at or below dew point, condensation will occur on it. It doesn't matter how breathable it is. And that's all about understanding relative humidity and dew point. And so it will happen. Now, how do we prevent it? We prevent it in one of two or three ways. We either warm the roof up, which is really difficult because actually the insulation that you put across the ceiling is designed to keep the roof cold. You improve ventilation to try to sweep some of that away, which is all well and good, but actually, you've got to be careful with that, because an over-ventilated roof can actually cause the roof to be very, very cold, and if the roof is very, very cold, it becomes more susceptible to insulation, to condensation. You can also have a problem where you over-insulate a ceiling. So if you put too much insulation above the ceiling, then you can have a problem with the dew point occurring inside that rock wall or inside that insulation, and the insulation wets up and it collapses because you've got the issue. Now, yes, the obvious way of reducing that problem inside the roof is to put a vapor check across the ceiling below the insulation that covers the ceiling. Now, that will control the amount of moisture that goes into that roof void. The kind of the perverse element there is that it will also increase probably the moisture loading in the occupied space below. Now, the bigger question for me, and this is where I think probably a bit of work needs to be done, is if you only get a bit of insulation on those felts for a few hours or a few days a year, then actually the roof can recover really well, because the roof gets hot in the summer or dries out, the water evaporates, the water then can pass through the membrane perfectly happily, and it's vented away. So actually these moisture loadings that you see, these kind of horrible photographs, and there was one in the presentation of lots and lots of water on the underside of the felt, is mostly transient, but actually if it's so bad that it's causing water to drip onto the insulation and then stain the ceiling, something has to be done about it. Not actually that easy to work through, but it can be, and it probably will involve the application of an additional vapor layer. Additional ventilation, if the ventilation in the roof is really bad, yes, but actually most roofs are pretty leaky. As far as ventilation is concerned, I see an awful lot of stuff on the chat rooms about, well, there didn't look as though there was any ventilation in the roof. Ventilation in the roof is important, but actually it's much easier to achieve than you may think, because tiles don't necessarily provide a good cover. Felts are never bonded, so there's lots of air gaps there. And usually at the eaves, unless somebody's gone nuts and stuffed insulation into the eaves, and that can happen, then you will get some air leakage there as well. But a really interesting subject. I think there should be a lot more work done on it and a lot more understanding. I am now waxing lyrical, and on my hobby horse, I'll shut up.
No, that's good. So moving on, I'm going to try and squeeze in 3 questions if I can. So keep your answers short if you can, Steve. Faye Alexander is asking, this is more focusing on molds. Should we be considering sampling and mold species identification as part of a routine damp house inspection? Are some species of mold more toxic than others?
You asked me that question and asked me to keep it short. Okay, so
well, as short as you can.
On mold sampling, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Why would you do that? For me, you've got a canary in the cage. The mold is simply an illustration that you've got something to deal with. The mold itself, yes, there are molds that have different characteristics with their reactivity with people, and yes, there are some molds that are toxic. But toxic molds, the whole kind of question of toxic molds, we did this to death a few years ago, is in many respects a bit of a misnomer. Stachybotrys, and there's 1 or 2 others that are quite nasty, but actually one of the things I learned quite recently is some of these particularly toxic molds don't actually liberate a whole lot of spores into the air. They actually rely on insect pollinization or insect transfer, so they have sticky spores. And so there's an awful lot of stuff that, unless you're a mycologist and you specialize in this stuff, you can trip over your own bootlaces on. And why would we bother doing that? Actually take the point of view, if mold is there, you've got a moisture imbalance, deal with the moisture imbalance and not get too carried away with the mold. If you're really worried at that point, mask up, get somebody to wipe it off, get it cleaned and overpainted. Then your problem has mostly gone away. Let's not get, for me, I'm not going to get too wound up or excited or judgmental about mold toxicity. The fact is that actually the particulates and the nasty stuff that's going on in the building are probably as important, including house dust mite, feces and other imbalances like CFCs and VOCs and carbon dioxide levels are probably quite high as well. If you've got very poor living accommodation and you've got lots of other things going on, so yeah, not take your mind. I try and get people to not concentrate on that mold toxicity thing and concentrate on the fact that it's there and you need to get rid of it.
Well, just one last quick, because we do need to cut off, but it's just because this has been asked in the chat and emailed over to me. To do with your FLIR camera that you use to measure the RH, people are asking, what would you recommend as a kind of budget solution as a starting off? Would you just recommend the FLIR, or is there other brands out there?
I don't sell anything, and there are lots of machines out there. Some cheap, some expensive. I've got one. I was going to reach out and find it. I can't actually see it, but I've got hygrometers and thermometers that cost 20 quid each. That FLIR camera, that FLIR machine, it's quite cool because it has everything on one screen and you can scroll between them. But there's lots of machines out there. And don't get too hung up about the actual numbers. It's about the comparisons. Most moisture meters will have a variation of 2 or 3 degrees or 2 or 3%. It's not a big deal. It's actually being able to use these things and understand what they say. And very cheap moisture meters actually most of them work okay. The issue really is having the knowledge and the understanding, experience, and the confidence to actually interpret them. It's not the machine that you buy; it's the interpretation of what the machines tell you. And I ain't gonna tell you which machine to go and buy, because that's more than my pay grade's worth.
No, I hear you. No, and thanks for that, Steve. No, folks, just to let you know, there was a lot of questions came in thick and fast. I appreciate we didn't manage to get them through them all. Again, I will pass them over to Steve if he can get an opportunity to answer them and come back to you. Great. However, some of your questions may be answered from some of the resources that we actually have up here. Now, if you are looking for additional information, those that were at the beginning, you would have heard me mention about going along to our professional pages where you'll find a whole variety of free information regarding damp, condensation, ventilation, etc., etc. There is as well, for those of you who need to share out information to homeowners, you can visit the homeowner section, and we do have help, tips and advice that you can share out regarding mold, dampness, condensation, blah, 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 so on and so forth. There is, for professionals out there as well, 2 resources that I would strongly advise you to maybe check out if you are eager to learn more. That is the PC CPD video library, where you'll find a variety of content that includes previous webinars as well as conference videos. But also as well, we have our technical document library, where if you really want to dive into the detail and get quite technical, you can find all the documents there. Now, just for those, I've just sent the links to those particular areas just into the chat. They will be in the show notes for anyone that's watching in the replay on this, so you can just click on the links in the notes. Now, if you are interested in learning more, there is opportunities of training courses within the PCA. I would encourage you just to go to our training section on the site. There is an actual section for mold, condensation, dampness training. These are
Andy, let me, can I am going to butt in just right now. You know, all of that's great, but the PCA can't actually go out on the site and help you. We have, you know, a huge reservoir of members with incredible levels of knowledge and insight and experience, and they must be the primary resource for people struggling with dampness and mold problems in their homes. I'm sure you're going to wind up now, Andy, but I promised myself that I'd be on the road by 10:10, so I'm going to have to pack up and go and say goodbye. So thank you all very, very much indeed for listening. I hope to meet or see or speak to many of you over the coming years. Bye-bye.
Well, folks, just as Steve's just leaving there, just to kind of just wind up, as I say, because I know he needed to rush off, our next webinar is now live on the website. You can see it to there, Japanese Knotweed, back to basics for professionals. Simply just go to the link there, /webinars, and you can find out more detail about it. But without further ado, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone that tuned into us. I know Steve has now left, but I just want to say a thank you to himself as well. And hopefully everyone has a lovely rest of the day. Take care, everyone.